This session is now being recorded.
It's on the record.
We are officially on the record. Well, I don't want to reward folks who are on time. So why don't we just go ahead and get started. You have joined the LIRA workshop called The Critical Role of New Union Member Orientation in the Janus Era. For folks who've already forgotten, Janus was the big Supreme Court decision that basically turned our public sector into right to work. So of course, making contact with new members is even all the more important now in the public sector, as it has been for many years in right to work states. But generally, I think this topic is really critical now in this pandemic era, where being a union member and having rights and protections at work, particular safety and health protections, is really a matter of life or death. And so it's so critical for new people coming into a workplace that has a union to know their rights and to make early contact with their union. So I'm glad we're having this discussion today. I feel like it's really important now. And I am going to just share quickly. So our panelists today are Paul Clark from Penn State, John Amon from the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, Michael Wasser from the Department for Professional Employees at the AFL-CIO, John Lepley of the United Steelworkers Education Department, and Michelle Mihalik at Steelworkers Local 1163. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Paul. We've asked our speakers to keep things relatively short, 4 to 5 minutes, so that we have enough time for a good Q&A session.
Okay, thank you, Erin. I'm going to start by providing some background information on new member orientation programs, so we're sort of all on the same page here. Just to be clear, we're talking about organized presentations and discussions that union conduct with new hires to introduce them to and inform them about the union that represents them. In most cases, these new hires are not actually new members yet, but orientation provides a great opportunity for unions to convince new hires to join the union. And this is particularly significant, as Erin suggested, in a Janus or post-Janus world where union security clauses are the exception and not the rule, not available in the public sector, increasingly not as common in the private sector. So that's one benefit that new member orientation programs provide. But I've been looking at these programs and studying them for a long time, and there's a second benefit, important benefit, that new member orientation programs potentially provide to unions, and that is they provide an opportunity to increase union commitment and participation. So you have a short-term benefit of getting members, hires to join the union, and a longer-term benefit of increasing commitment and participation in the union among those hires. Now, I say that orientation programs increase commitment and participation. How do we know that? Well, in part because that is what the results of a recent national study of new hires and new members in a large union that I conducted indicates. Those were the results of a study that we conducted. And what we did was we started with 2,000 new members, and we did 2 surveys shortly after they were hired and a year later. And we found a number of interesting things. First of all, we found that only about 38% of them had actually gone through a new member orientation program. And that's an interesting and important finding in itself, because it means that the union is missing a great opportunity with a little less than 2/3 of its members to make a good first impression. We also asked those new members if they had found the new member orientation experience, those who went through it, helpful. And about 85% of new members who went through the experience found it either somewhat, very, or extremely helpful. We also had these folks fill out an instrument on union commitment that measured their level of commitment to the union. And here you see the results broken down by those who didn't have an orientation experience, those who found the experience useful, and those who didn't find it useful. And you'll see that those members who went through the experience and found it helpful had a higher level of commitment than both those who didn't go through an orientation and those who did but didn't find it helpful. And that's a statistically significant difference there. But if you note the bars, the second finding basically is that if you don't do a new member orientation program well, the result is lower levels of commitment among the participants, lower even than those who didn't go through a program. So what this suggests to us is if you're going to do a new member orientation program, you need to do it well. If you do it poorly, you're actually going to do more damage in terms of making a negative impression on the new members than if you didn't even do a program. And lastly, a year after the initial survey, we went back, we surveyed the people who had had a new member experience the year before, and we asked them to fill out a scale on their participation in their union, a series of activities that they could check yes or no to whether they were participating in. And what we found was that those members who had a high level of commitment, had gone through a new member orientation experience, found it helpful or very helpful, were significantly more engaged, were participating to a greater degree in the union than those members who hadn't had a positive new member experience and had lower overall union commitment levels. And so the bottom line in terms of what this tells us is that a good new member orientation program, a program that's done well, will potentially increase member commitment and participation. And commitment and participation are two critical things that unions need if they're going to build a more effective union. So with that sort of baseline of information, I'll turn it back over to Erin for the next speaker.
Paul, and if you can stop sharing, great. And my apologies, I forgot to introduce. Paul is, if you don't know him, is the professor and director of the School of International Labor and Employment Relations at Penn State. He's worked several decades as a labor educator and union consultant. And as he just shared, he's completed 2 major national studies on new member orientation programs. He really is the eminent expert on this issue. So now we're going to introduce John Amon, who is a business representative in the ICG New York office for the IATSE, sorry. He handles all manner of contracts for the local, but specializes in commercials, multi-camera TV specials, and other non-theatrical productions. This includes negotiating and administering live television event agreements and organizing this area of work. He's also been involved in lobbying efforts on behalf of the film and TV industry in New York. And please take it away, John.
All right. So I didn't provide a PowerPoint, but I do call my presentation the challenge of new member orientations in my local. The IATC Local 600, we're also known as the International Cinematographers Guild, is a local union that represents cinematographers, camera operators, camera assistants, still photographers, other visual and camera technicians, and publicists on a wide array of film and TV productions. So we're a nationwide guild. We have offices across the country. Over 90% of our members are freelancers. And that really gets to the challenge because with regard to providing member orientations, what we're up against is the fact that getting work is the one activity that trumps everything else for our members. They're constantly looking for work. And if they have to choose between attending an orientation or a union meeting and getting a job, they'll have to take the job. Now, some IA locals handle this in different ways. Others try to make orientations mandatory if they can. Others try to schedule orientations at times when they think most people can attend. In the New York office of Local 600, where I work, we have a long history of combining the application process of joining the union with an orientation. But it's not like an orientation with you would imagine where you have a bunch of people in a room. It's really a one-on-one conversation that our Director of Membership Services has with the new applicant. So the individual comes in, they fill out his or her application, to pay the fees, and at that point, the director will talk to them about our union, its history, their obligations to the union, how our collective bargaining agreements work. Very importantly, our health and pension plans, which is a big draw for people to join our unions. And then he will introduce that person to members of the staff that are in the office, immediately providing them with sort of a visual context in which they know who the union people are. Now, it's important to note, and I think Paul really hit on this, is that whether an orientation is one-on-one or it's in a classroom setting, its goal is to introduce the members to the local union. So for us, efforts are made within our union to continue to provide opportunities to engage members. So for example, once someone has filled out his or her application, they are directed to attend the next regional council meeting of our local union to be formally sworn in as a member. They don't have to do this, but they're strongly encouraged to do this. So what does that do? Well, it's the officers that perform this activity. So they're meeting the leadership of the union, they're meeting business staff, and they're getting an idea of how the local is run. In addition to that, our local has a number of different types of activities, trainings, screenings where cinematographers talk about films that they've worked on. These draw a lot of members because they're great networking opportunities. They're great opportunities to learn. At those meetings, local leaders and business staff will talk about union issues, getting members engaged in that aspect of things. Also, because our members work in a freelance basis, oftentimes it's the union office that meets members on set, on film sets. So people like myself go to film jobs and we will meet with members and we'll talk about the issues that they have on the job and a contract that is covering the work that they're working under. But we'll also talk about issues related to our constitution and bylaws, lobbying efforts that we're engaged in, and we answer members' questions. So new members will often buttonhole us about the myriad of questions that came up when they were going through their informal orientation. We have a strong social media presence, and we have a long history of older members really taking younger members by the hand and talking to them not just about their craft, but about what their obligations are to the union. So for us, constant engagement between the local union leadership and staff with rank and file members, hopefully, builds upon the basic information that was presented in the orientation and demonstrates real ways in which the union is relevant in the lives of the members. And so with that, unfortunately, I have to go because I have to do that. I have to go into another union meeting. So I thank you. Take care.
Thanks, John. And we will, for those who came late to the Zoom, we will reach out his email address. If you have any direct questions for John, feel free to reach out to him. So now I'm pleased to introduce Michael Wasser, who is the Assistant to the President and Legislative Director for the AFL-CIO's Department for Professional Employees, where he's responsible for conducting outreach to labor and non-labor organizations representing DPE before Congress on issues important to professional technical workers and working with affiliate unions to identify and advance issues important to professional technical workers. In his role at DPE, Michael has worked to develop materials on new member orientation and promote new member programs among the department's affiliate unions. And I've had the pleasure of working with Michael during his several years at Jobs with Justice and American Rights at Work.
Thanks, Erin, and also a proud Penn State alum, so to have Paul and Erin. This is everything going full circle. I see Paul Whitehead in the audience. So thanks for having me and for letting me be part of this program. Explaining and introducing DPE alone could take 5 minutes, so I'm going to try to do it as quick as I can. I'll share my screen real quick so you can see our 24 affiliates. DPE is a trade department within the AFL-CIO structure. Most people think about trade departments, they immediately think of building trades. We jokingly refer to ourselves as the trade department without a trade, what brings together our 24 national unions, which includes both the IATSE and the steelworkers, is organizing and representing professionals. And our 24 affiliates represent over 4 million professionals in almost every sector, almost every occupation, from education to healthcare to STEM to public administration to the arts, entertainment, and media industries. And DPE does several things with our affiliates, but a main point to focus on here, and something that Erin referred to as part of my work, is facilitating collaboration and providing assistance in order to strengthen individual unions. And one of our focuses has always been on member engagement resources and the importance of member engagement for building stronger, more effective unions. And that's because at DPE, we are definitely followers of the Paul Clark gospel, particularly when it comes to the value of new hire orientation, new member orientation, depending on how you want to refer to it, from that day one engagement. So DPE works with our affiliates in compelling and effective messages, particularly for professionals. We do a lot of work about how professionals see themselves, how they see the workplace, and how they see unions and what they want from a union. And for DPE, you can see in the top row, the second over is AFGE, IFPTE. I see Stan Sorcer's in the Zoom chat with us. So these are unions who have members in the federal sector, which of course has always been an open shop right to work. So they've had a lot of experience fine-tuning strategies for new member or new hire orientation. So we've looked to them certainly in a long term of training up. But just to keep it broad, what DPE's focus has really been on is helping our affiliates think through how do we take what I like to call the Paul Clark fundamentals and putting them into specific circumstances. Because when you look across DPE's affiliates, well, John just touched on it, is freelance capacity. So people who, one of our affiliates, this is particularly in the broadcast arena, their members look at a calendar and they try to fill the squares. They have 30 squares and they have to fill every one of those, or as many of those to make the rent and to put food on the table. Obviously for a lot of those members, not all, but a lot are out of work right now because of the pandemic. And then the entertainment industry overall is very unique in the process of membership. I can answer questions later, but it's an incredibly unique situation for how you interact with people and how they come into interaction with the union. And then we, just to use an example from the entertainment space, several DPE affiliate unions are national unions that don't have locals. So you belong, SAG-AFTRA as an example, Actors Equity Association is an example. So how do you, if you don't have local, well, I should say SAG-AFTRA has some locals as a legacy of the AFTRA, but generally it's national in scope. How do they interact with their union, particularly how they first come and interact with it? So for example, Actors Equity Association, how do you take someone who, so Actors Equity has offices in New York and LA and Chicago, but someone who's working in Washington, DC at the arena stage, how do they come in contact and interact with the union and make that person feel like that union, that this is their union and they're a part of it? And then mixed units or mixed locals. Steelworkers is an example of, and this sort of goes to the academic definition of professional, but steelworkers, IBW, people who have unions that have members in different classifications and identities of how they make sure that professionals see that there's a place for them in their union and see that the union is representative of them. So those are just some of the broad issues that we work with. I'm happy to talk more in the discussion, but just want to provide an overview of what DPE is doing in this space for a group of affiliates, a group of unions who are really leading. Today, 42% of all union members are professionals. So this is the future of the labor movement and bringing them in from day one to build that commitment that Paul talked about.
Okay, thank you, Michael. If you can stop screen share, great. So next I'd like to introduce John Lepley, who's a staff representative in the National Education Department of the United Steelworkers of America. He regularly teaches programs on a variety of subjects, including member engagement at the Steelworkers Education Center at Linden Hall and in the field. He was involved in the union's effort to design state-of-the-art materials for the union's locals on new member orientation as part of the Steelworkers' efforts to increase the effectiveness of these programs. Take it away, John.
All right, thank you, Erin. So good afternoon, everybody. Paul Whitehead, I don't know if you remember me, but I was an intern about 13 years ago when you were still the general counsel, so you might recognize me. In my capacity in the education department, I'm also sort of the unofficial staff archivist for the union, and I say that because I've actually discovered old 16 millimeter reels of new member films that the steelworkers produced in the late 1960s, and actually with a new member department that was created in the late 1970s. So I say that because this is a long-standing, ongoing project of the United Steelworkers. That new member department, I don't know what happened to it. I think it kind of went away with the collapse of the steel industry in the early 80s. Our most recent iterations of the new member programs were really sort of kickstarted by the events that happened in the Midwest in the early 2010s with longstanding free bargaining states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Indiana, becoming right-to-work states where we have significant membership in a number of sectors. So there we really kicked it into high gear where we are teaching new member orientation in every subject. I mean, I've gone out and done long 2-3 hour classes on new member orientation, but I'm also weaving it into this is an important part of a steward's responsibilities. This is a basic part of local union administration, no different than having auditors regularly check the books and stuff like that. So I think throughout the union, new member orientation has really emerged as a core part of union building. Now, like Michael said just a few moments ago, Paul Clark's work, particularly with building more effective unions, really informs how we teach. But I think at a practical level, what we teach, we're really, for lack of a better term, stealing what we have learned from members in longtime right-to-work states, particularly Texas, Louisiana, Arizona, and actually some units throughout the country that are don't have union security language. Particularly, Erin, I've lost track of time, so you're going to have to wave at me. Particularly in the oil sector. So for example, there's one local 13-1 in Texas City, Texas. It's a very large amalgamated local, a tough industry, the oil sector. So this is just tough labor relations, I'll say that. And they have historically run a very high membership. And their practical solutions are really, I think, core part of being a trade unionist. So they do the orientation session as soon as possible. It might not be part of the onboarding process, but they do it quickly. They build relationships with the new hires there, and then they delegate their stewards to do regular follow-up and checking in with people. A lot of time they're not always talking union. They're just building relationships and getting to know them. And particularly in that sector, it's health and safety, which my sister Michelle Mihalik will talk about in a few moments. One of our biggest challenges from the education department is the availability or the opportunity for locals to do this. So there are a couple of units that have what I would say is limousine class language. They have 2 weeks with new hires. Not in a class per se, but they have older, more experienced workers paired with newer ones to show them the job. Then there are locals, the average is anywhere from 4 hours to 1 hour with new hires. Some locals don't have language at all, so they're having to do this on the fly, on the shop floor. So this language is, if it's not already in collective bargaining agreements, this is a #1 priority in all negotiations now. And then another one of our bigger challenges is training local union leaderships to do this for all the reasons that Paul have talked about, that this is a core part of building your union, building future activists and leaders.
Thanks, Sean. Everyone's being so timely. We're going to have a nice amount of time for Q&A. That's great. And so finally, I'd like to introduce Michelle Mihalik, who's a member activist in the United Steelworkers Local 1163 in Minnesota. Michelle works for Sappi Paper and is a graduate of the United Steelworkers National Leadership Program. She's been active in building member engagement in her local union and in other locals in the pulp and paper sector. So take it away, Michelle.
There we go. Okay, as she mentioned, I've worked for Sappi North America for about 22 years now, and recently, or back in 2014, I was able to go to the United Steelworkers Leadership Scholarship Program out in Linden Hall. And after my first year of the 4-year program, I knew that new employee orientation was something that we at my local could definitely improve upon. So when I got back to my local, I reached out to my e-board members and we collaborated on possibly putting forth a PowerPoint to introduce to our new members. As I was working on that, we were in contract negotiations and we were able to change the language in our contract to allow us up to 2 hours with our new hires during their 1-week orientation that they get with our company. So in 2015, I was able to, in collaboration with the union president, we together met with the new hires and I created the PowerPoint presentation to show them. The PowerPoint starts with the definition of the union because there are so many that have never been part of a union or a union household before. It also goes over the committees of the United Steelworkers that the members can join. And because many have never been part of a union, it also shows a slide showing where their union dollars go and how it's broken up between the local and the international. There are slides that make up our executive board, who holds the positions in our local. We also go over the day, time, and place where our union meetings are being held. And then the bulk of the slides go over shifts, benefits, eligibility, transfers, and general aspects of our contract. Pretty much the meat and potatoes in our contract. We present our PowerPoint and we make it a really relaxed atmosphere. We basically just sit amongst the new hires. There's generally, there could be up to about 15 of them in the room. And we leave it a wide open discussion so that at any time during the presentation, they can just blurt out questions. It's very, very relaxed, and we want to make sure that they're getting the most out of the presentation. We always wrap up this session with a discussion on safety. The pulp and paper mill have several large machines that are very unforgiving, and we also talk about 2 fatalities that have actually occurred in the last 25 years. So that stresses upon them how quick something so fatal can happen. We also instill in them that it's very important to stop and ask questions if they're not feeling safe. If you're being asked to do something in a manufacturing setting and you're thinking, my goodness, I don't feel quite safe doing this, you should definitely stop and ask questions. Never, ever hesitate to hesitate. They'll never be reprimanded for asking and for stopping to be safe. I was fortunate enough to share the PowerPoint at the 2016 USW Paper Bargaining Conference in Pittsburgh in 2016. And at the end of my presentation, I offered to email the PowerPoint to any local that would like it. And I was taken up by several locals, so I emailed that out for them. Because our mill suffered a hiring freeze in 2008, we've had a hard time catching up on hiring and training people as others retire and quit. As a consequence, we have a lot of green on green training where new employees are training in new hires. So this brought forth our mentorship program. Each new hire is assigned a union mentor near their area to check in on new hires at least once a week or more. Because not every individual trainer is a good trainer, we want to make sure that our mentors are making sure they're getting the information they need and that they feel that they're getting adequately trained, that their questions are being answered. If there are issues, we can work with the company to get them the proper training they need, whether it's moving them to another shift or delegating a new trainer. As a mentor, we want to make sure that they are asking questions, voicing concerns to help keep them safe and understand their positions and what's expected of them. We want everyone to get through their probationary period and feel confident in their new role at the mill. We encourage all new members to attend union meetings monthly, even while on probation, to get a feel for what goes on at them. We like to encourage them to become involved and not to be afraid to speak up. Our local is only as strong as its members participate. In closing, we face a rapidly retiring workforce in the era of businesses running rapidly understaffed. A lot of information and experience is lost when our seasoned employees retire, and it takes so long to get new employees trained in on their own. It's becoming even harder to retain employees that are willing to work a shift work schedule in a manufacturing setting. A good union orientation is the start of a dialogue with new hires to help get them to know our business and union and make sure they're able to do it safely.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Michelle. So now we'll have a Q&A. Can I ask folks if they're comfortable to turn on their videos so we feel like we're having a bit more of a conversation than just staring at names? Great, thank you. So why don't we go back to start with the chat. I see Shannon had the first question on how union commitment is measured.
Oh, that actually got answered. Yeah, thanks.
Great, okay. And then we've got a question from Jim to Paul. Jim, you want to go ahead and share your question?
Sure. I was just curious. You talked about your new member orientation like it was something people like they attended. So it kind of sounds like you're not going out and finding. And see, I don't know how big a group, you guys are working in a lot bigger groups than we do, but you're not actually going out and necessarily seeking these people out that are new to the bargaining group. Is that assumption correct?
Yeah, this was a national union with locals spread across the country. So they had different practices, and some were, in many cases, they had the opportunity to talk with all new hires who were going through the employer's orientation program. As Michelle sort of suggested, they had negotiated anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour with the new employees. But there were also locals where the locals had to meet with the new hires outside of work because they couldn't get that bargaining language. So there was some of both across the board in that 2,000 members or 2,000 new hires, yeah.
Don, you have a question for Paul or others?
Yes, thank you. I was just curious, especially since it seems like a pretty big group, whether you had a broader or narrow range of ages. If these were mostly young people, which normally one thinks of new hires, then it's curious about then the commitment they exhibited even after years sounded pretty impressive. Yeah. On the other hand, if they were old or a broader age distribution, then maybe the older people had exposure to unions through family members or others, and I wondered if you had any feel for whether that made a difference.
Yeah, it's a good question, Dawn. And as I wrote back to Dawn privately on chat, I told him I wanted to go back and look at our breakdown by age, so I didn't give him inaccurate information. I'll do that, and I'll answer Dawn online. But it's a good question in the sense that where you have a range of ages, you know, we all talk about the different generations now, and they are very different. And in a union that has, and our sample included people who were both older new hires, and then very young new hires. And sometimes a union will be faced with doing an orientation with groups across the generations. And one of the things we found from our research is that's difficult to do because the generations are all different. And in terms of best practices, one of the things we suggest with unions is that you try to match up whoever is going to be conducting the new hire orientation. You try to have someone who's in an age group that's similar to the people you're talking with. I'll use the example of a union I worked with who thought the member with the longest seniority should do the new hire orientation. And the new hires were 18 to 22, and the person doing the orientation was 67 or something, and would start out, he was a curmudgeon, and he'd start out talking about, you young people, you don't know what it was like to fight for the union 60 years ago. That doesn't work. You need someone from that generation who can connect with them, who knows social media, who knows the vocabulary. So it is a good question. Not to mention the idea that people who are older are going to have a lot more exposure just generally in the environment to unions, in their family, in the news, as opposed to 18 to 22-year-olds who are often blank slates. They just don't know anything.
Thanks, Paul. And I'll just add it. I think it's important to think about not just age, but race and ethnicity and gender of the people that you're putting out there representing the union. And does that reflect your membership too? I see that Paul Whitehead had a question for John and Michelle. You want to share that?
Bearing in mind what Paul Clark found about commitment and participation increasing as a result of good orientation, does your experience provide some support for that? Can you give illustrations of what you think are the effects of your efforts at orientation, please?
So anecdotally, what I can tell you is if you go back to when we started this latest iteration, 2012, 13, 14, 15, a lot of our employers had just recovered from the 2007, 8, 9 financial crisis, and they were starting to hire new people for the first time. And so we had sort of this bimodal distribution in a lot of our workplaces, a ton of new hires and then a ton of people at the other end who were getting ready to retire. So I think across the union, US, Canada, in many sectors, we were faced with an issue where in a couple of years, we're not going to have any of these folks at this end of the spectrum. So we need to build new leadership. What we have seen, and I don't have any hard figures for you or anything like that, but this has led to an increase, not every local, but a lot of locals of younger members serving on the mandated or standing committees in the USW Constitution. So the civil and human rights, safety and health, organizing, workers' compensation, and then any of the other number programs to get members involved in the life of the union, our rapid response program. I'm totally drawing a blank on the next gen program too, which I would say is sort of dealing with this very issue well, that we have this young cohort of people, many of whom did not grow up in union families, or they've heard only negative stuff said about it. So we have seen that. In the leadership program that Michelle is a graduate of, that Paul teaches at, we've had people come back in years 2, 3, and 4 and say, we implemented this, we've had some success. So I know one brother at an ATI mine in Utah, of all places, was able to get this going, and he reported that they got 70 new hires in 1 year to sign membership cards. So, I mean, hearing that made me feel pretty darn good. Michelle, anything that you might add, sister?
Just that I think that, before the PowerPoint presentation, we would have just an individual stand up in front, generally the president of the local, stand up and just talk at the new hires for about an hour. And after, they're in an all day being talked at, from the HR representative to their insurance benefits representative, that they get really over inundated with information. So when you can sit back and do a PowerPoint where they can see it, and you can explain the different committees of the local, you're able to then spark their interest to maybe be part of Next Generation for the younger folks that are being hired, or Women of Steel, because paper manufacturing, I feel very fortunate. My mill's 25% women. So having a strong Women of Steel committee has always been something we prided ourselves on. But to have the visual, and I go over a couple events and stuff that we participate in, then they can really see kind of, not just the derelict of being, of everything they have to deal with being a new member, but the fun stuff that comes alongside with it too. So I feel like they feel like they want to participate a lot more that way.
Thank you.
That's great. Janet's got a question.
Sure. I work in healthcare in Massachusetts, so we have agency fee shops and we have time at orientation to sign up members. So we don't have the open shop challenges, although our public sector sister does at the sister union does at the moment. But with COVID, we've got tons of people working from home, and that looks like it's going to continue for quite a while. And it makes our one-to-one organizing that starts at orientation and then follows the person to their department and hooks them up with a rep and so on, kind of have to be rethought. And I'm wondering if anybody has experience doing, this kind of orientation where you're meeting your members on Zoom or whatever and trying to make that into a warm, personal, information-filled kind of experience for people.
I can jump in here. So I started to reference this earlier, but within DPE, this is an issue that a lot of many of the arts and entertainment unions face. So I'll give one specific example. Actors Equity Association. This is the union of stage actors and stage managers. So think Hamilton. Obviously, the big places for their live theater members is New York City, in LA. I also want to say that it's very weird to be talking about this because essentially all of their members are out of work right now with the COVID pandemic. Actors Equity Association does not have locals, as I referenced earlier. They have 3 what they call office cities: New York City, Chicago, and Los Angeles. And they do their orientations. They do an orientation session at a regular scheduled time at the cities, and they try to do one on the East Coast time and one on the West Coast time to catch people there. But you have Actors Equity members all across the country. You have, think about the theaters in Georgia, theaters in Philly, theaters in Minneapolis, name the state, there are Actors Equity members. And so they live cast those so that those people can be a part of the program and be involved. They try to this is a little hard to do as a one-to-one comparison of the current moment, but they try to group them together with other equity members near them. What they do is they try to time it so that and I see Paul sort of referenced this in the chat. So getting the orientation packet, like the information about the union and a letter from their president, information about member services, the benefits they get from being a member, and then also some kind of equity swag to really bring them into that conversation. This is true also for other unions that have the same issue that may not do the live telecast, that some have packaged webinars, pre-planned webinars to send out to people with nuggets to sort of make it interactive or to let them be a part of it. But the second part is where I think the lesson learned is for the current moment. And that is, so I know Paul believes this, I know the steelworkers believe this. We always preach that orientation is not just the one session, a quality orientation is the individual follow-up too. So we really stress that our affiliates find a way to interact one-on-one with every person. In fact, we, before the pandemic, talked about FaceTime. If the person was willing, I wouldn't FaceTime someone out of the blue, but if they're interested in doing a FaceTime or a Zoom call, to have that one-on-one conversation with them, one union member to another union member, one leader to a member, one activist to a member, that really is where you can build that one-on-one camaraderie. And I suspect, and this is one of the Paul Clark tools, is to talk about the informal ways that you can help someone in the workplace. And I suspect that working from home and the tips and tricks of doing that is one way that unions can really show their value immediately to a new person who's trying to get up to speed in a place where you're not even leaving your house.
Yeah, I wanted to give a quick example on a virtual initiation or induction where you would have a meeting on Zoom. Maybe a local that's regional in nature has its local union meeting quarterly or monthly on Zoom, and you have the new member there to introduce them and sort of initiate them to the union. And beforehand, the union sends a packet to them, and it says, "Do not open until the meeting." And so in front of everybody there, they're then asked to open the envelope where they maybe have the union membership card, the union pin, and a nice item of swag that they can open. Now, the key to this is a nice item of swag, because if you send them pens and a bumper sticker, when they open the package, they're going to be disappointed. But if it's something nice, then they open it and they sort of appreciate that. And then you have this sort of community of people watching. And it was an interesting idea, I thought.
Maybe a nice mask with the union logo on it. That would be useful these days. Washable, cotton. John or Michelle, how are things going now? Is anything moving into virtual space for the steelworkers are doing?
Not that I'm aware of, but I imagine it has to be going on. We've just been a little siloed the past 3 months, so I have no anecdotes to offer on that. But on Paul, you recently posted about initiation and how important that is. And one thing that I use when I teach is I found this old image from the 1940s of mine workers taking the oath in Harlan County, and the caption is, "The union obligation is forever." And I hand that out in classes, and I say, if what we're going to learn in labor history is that they were union to their core, so they had something going on right here to underscore its importance. So just a little detour. Michelle, anything you hearing on the virtual front?
Right now, I'm not sure if we've actually brought on any new hires since the outbreak and the quarantining. But being that we are a paper mill, you don't stay home. You're an essential worker. So I would assume that if they were going to bring in new employees, they would probably just bring them in smaller groups, even if they do like 2 groups of 5. And then people would present to them. 1 or 2 people would be presenting to them at a time in a room with masks on. We all wear masks at the mill now. But I could see how very easily a PowerPoint can be used on Zoom, and I'm not even all that Zoom savvy, but I think that it could be done quite easily. And I like the idea of sending a package with some swag in it. And the United Steelworkers puts out a wonderful new employee orientation book that they can look at while going through stuff. And I could see that working quite well if we needed to do it that way. I do know, like at SAPI, most of our office workers, if they can work from home, are working from home, with maybe only a day or 2 a week at the office. So kind of interested to see how they would navigate bringing on new hires at this point, but I just don't know. I don't know what they're going to do.
Thanks. Shannon, you've got a good question. You want to share that?
Yeah, so I don't know if this is sort of like an obvious yes or an obvious no, but I'm coming from Canada, and when I think like talking to some members in comparable unions, like other grad student unions in the last couple of years, I'm always kind of taken aback by the level of engagement that they have as a well, I guess I shouldn't say as a result, but like they have to do a lot more work than we do, where we have union security in order to engage members. And so I guess maybe it's like a obvious conclusion from kind of, maybe it follows from Paul Clark's research, I'm not sure, but I also recognize that like maybe it's a crazy thing to ask because the people that are doing the work to increase membership numbers, like maybe you still feel like you're obviously doing worse off than before. So I just kind of want to ask, like, what's the sense, I guess, from anybody that feels that they could answer? Yeah.
Well, I've heard from that the teachers unions were not really as strongly impacted by Janus as they had anticipated. You know, might have something to do with all of the teacher strikes and real engagement of members, you know, around the Red for Ed stuff, but they really didn't struggle with signing up members after Janus in the way they had worried they would. I also heard that from AFSCME as well. They had not taken the same kind of hit on membership, and they all AFSCME, SEIU, NEA, and AFT all like put in a concerted effort, use Paul's research, but and also like really put a lot of investment into new hire orientations to and after Janus. And I haven't heard any real like serious devastation of membership since then, but maybe Paul, you've heard something.
Well, Shannon, it's sort of interesting. The whole idea of Janus was, it was pushed by the conservative anti-union element in this country, and they thought they would take out the public sector by doing away with union security there. And in a way, you could argue that they did the labor movement a favor, because you can get pretty complacent when your members have to join the union. So what's the incentive to do an orientation program and you know, lobby them to join the union if they got to do it anyway? And what it forced a lot of unions to do was to engage with their membership and to make the case as to why you should join the union. And unions like AFSCME and AFT, since this was in the legal system for like 4 or 5 years, worked for those 4 or 5 years to put in place all around the country programs to better engage members, current members, and to orient and engage new members. AFSCME had a program called AFSCME Strong that within 3 or 4 years, they had operating effectively in almost every corner of the country. I don't know that there's been a study done that explains exactly why, but most of these unions have not suffered significant member losses that everybody anticipated they would. And so it's all sort of conjecture. But my argument would be, as I just explained, that forced them to re-engage, and they did it well. And they built union commitment, and they got people involved and participating, and it actually strengthened the union, the labor movement, the public sector labor movement in some ways, as opposed to wiping it out.
Yeah, I'll just speak for DPE's unions. Our public sector unions at the state and local level, it certainly forced them to relearn some muscle memory. And we presented to all of our unions as, frankly, as a challenge, that they don't believe that you can convince someone that being a union member is appropriate for them, they don't further believe that you can convince them that they become a committed union member. And I think DPE's unions in the public sector who were impacted certainly have rose to the challenge, AFT being the largest one, American Federation of Teachers. But it also did something else, which is all of our private sector unions were just as reinvigorated in their member engagement and in their view of the value of new hire orientation, which obviously is hugely important, but not the only part to surviving the Janus moment. So I do actually, it's kind of interesting of the impact that it's had in the private sector too, at getting unions to rebuild those muscles about what it means to talk to members about how their union is there for them.
I'll echo what Mike Michael just said, particularly with our private sector units in Michigan, Wisconsin, Indiana, 2011, 12, 13, we were alarmed, but the drop-off hasn't been bad. And I think similar that this has reinvigorated a lot of those locals. Paul's work has really informed it, but like I've said, we have very old locals in longtime right to work states where historically, particularly in the oil and the rubber sector, they have always maintained high membership numbers. And I think, orientation is a part of that, but just effective servicing at the shop floor level. So these are very effective, well-organized local unions. And so I think, I'm not saying anything new.
Thanks, Sean. I think we have.
I was just going to add one more thing, which I think is
Yeah.
kind of an interesting perspective, is that hearing, I think a lot of the assumptions about where, for our affiliates, particularly the strengths and weaknesses of a post-Janus world didn't actually line up. This is just to prove the organizing muscle that had to work, which is that some of the strongest locals in terms of their ability to recruit and to sign up committed members are in the South, the Southeast, which is notoriously considered some of the most anti-union states. Just to give one example, the firefighters were chartering locals who won wage increases in localities where it was in theory illegal to bargain in the state and local level, but they blew right past that and said, we're going to come together and we're going to make our a united showing of why we need to be paid for a fair return on our work.
Yeah, thanks. And that was the geography of the Red for Ed. It was in Oklahoma and West Virginia and other places that folks were surprising to a lot of people. I think we have time for one quick question if anyone else has one. Okay, we will end 1 minute early. Thank you so much to all of our panelists and for folks for joining. And Paul, maybe do you want to just show the last slide again? Does that have our contact information? Or maybe Paul, if you want to just put in the chat your email if anyone wants to get more of your great research.
Yeah, I'll put my my email in chat here rather than pulling up the slide.
Great.
So thank you, everybody.
All right, thanks everyone.